Right, Mr. Vos, if you look at the picture on the right, can you what is it?
Well, what we can see here from comparison of the portion of the aircraft itself, it appears this part comes from the front area of the aircraft, telltale of the actual window here, which would be the pilot's window of the side of the aircraft. Now, it's obviously sustained a significant amount of damage from an explosive charge. What's actually interesting about this particular section is actually the regularity of the pattern of what we might assume is a fragmentary projectile. The larger holes and tears are actually not as indicative as the smaller, more consistent holes. Obviously, damage is rendered to these portions of aircraft as it separates from the aircraft itself, but there are telltale signatures within these smaller holes that indicate it would be from a fragmentary warhead, not unlike a SA-11 type of weapon.
Yeah, but can you tell it was actually SA-11, as been it's alleged that was the missile to have downed the plane?
With a simple sort of section, no, because there are several surface-to-air missiles with very, very similar fragmentary warhead types. To pinpoint and say this was an SA-11 would betray that the warhead itself is actually very similar to those used in a number of armed forces, both legacy and modern systems. So the weapon type itself, no. However, is the pattern of damage consistent with a surface-to-air missile? I would say yes, based on what we're seeing, it is.
Is there still a possibility that it was something completely different, like the explosion of an engine?
It is always possible. However, there again, you look at telltale signs like the consistency of the pattern of damage. So if you imagine a warhead going off, it has very small fragments which are meant to spread out over a period of distance and cause as much damage as possible to the aircraft. An engine explosion would cause significant damage, depending on the type of explosion, of course. But the damage would be fairly irregular because there wouldn't be a lot of pattern to how the engine sort of broke up or spun off centripetally different types of portions. So you would look at much more oblique sort of grazing type of holes rather than a more consistent pattern of holes, which you're seeing out of some of the various portions of the aircraft that are coming across.
And these SA-11 missiles, they're not made to have a direct hit on their targets, is it?
No, actually that would be less effective, ironically. They actually have a proximity fuse, which means when they get a certain proximity from the aircraft, anywhere from 17 to 30 meters, they detonate, and what this allows is almost, if you imagine a shotgun pattern effect. So it allows the shrapnel to separate and create a bit of a cloud of fragmentation, the purpose of which being is that the fragments are traveling at a very high velocity and are intended to cause as much damage across a wide area as possible. These weapons are engineered to engage sort of high performance fighter aircraft. A target such as this, if it were engaged by a surface-to-air missile, would be very, very unable to sustain a direct engagement with one of these weapons.
Yeah, and compared to a fast, small military jet, this is almost like a sitting duck.
Indeed. There isn't a 100% kill rate, obviously. It could have failed to detonate, it could have detonated prematurely, but if the weapon was working as it was supposed to, then yes, it would cause catastrophic damage.
What evidence more do we need to determine what type of missile this was?
Well, securing any physical portion of the plane would go a long way. That would allow ballistic experts and sort of experts in explosives to see what type of explosive, if there was a powder residue on the skin of the aircraft, and then looking individually at the engagement profile would allow one to say with fair certainty that this was a surface-to-air missile, and most likely due to the pattern arrangement that it could well be a SA-11 type system.
We've heard several reports now that the wreckage has been tampered with, that pieces have been moved. Mm-hmm. Can it be tampered in such a way that it's almost going to be impossible for investigators to determine what actually happened?
It would be very, very difficult to alter a piece of the aircraft to the point that it would be unrecognizable to an investigator. There's almost like a fingerprint. Any sort of pattern done by a high-speed projectile is very hard to undo. So if the wreckage was to be secured with battle damage such as this, one could be fairly certain that the correct officials will be able to come to the correct conclusions as far as what brought down this aircraft.
Yeah, so a piece like this, like we see here on the right,
Yes.
if you can manage to get your hands on that, that will almost be enough. You can get really far in your investigations.
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah. So the only thing they could do is to make it disappear, to make it really difficult.
The way to complicate this, yes, would just be to police up as much of the damaged portions as possible. However, it wouldn't take very many portions of the aircraft to draw the same conclusions. You wouldn't need the entire, let's say, front cabin in order to determine that it was a surface-to-air missile engagement. You would probably only need a portion of this size to draw those conclusions.
Yeah. We've seen an image on the left as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is that similar to what we see on the right?
It is. I've seen various photographs similar to the one on the left of that same piece of wreckage, which there again, the jagged portions and the large holes are actually of less interest, but in the middle of that particular portion you can see a consistent sort of quarter-sized pattern of holes, which wouldn't be consistent with the portion of the aircraft tearing away from internal sparring or the actual frame of the aircraft. It would be more consistent with the loss of paint and the slight sort of divots around the hole themselves, which would mean it would be a high-speed impact, of which certainly a piece of the aircraft falling off or whatnot or striking the ground wouldn't have the same sort of pattern.
With all the information we have now, pictures, information from American intelligence, from satellites, how certain can we be, or how possible, how likely is it that this was a definite missile strike?
I think given the amount of evidence and sort of creating a confluence between all the available pieces of information, you would be able to create a almost irrefutable story of how this tragedy actually occurred. The level of certainty will never be 100%, of course, but I would say that most of the indications that are present at this point are increasingly pointing towards a surface-to-air missile engagement.
Will it be a lot more difficult to determine who actually shot the missile?
That will be much more difficult. Obviously, without having some sort of corroborative evidence, you can say that obviously the aircraft was engaged by a surface-to-air missile, but who actually engaged that, who the operators were, what their nationalities were, that will be very, very difficult to ascertain.